The Steam Deck released in 2022 to great fanfare. After all, it was a portable gaming PC that was capable of playing current-gen titles and respectable frame rates. Reviewers at the time loved it and saw its potential even if there were still a few software issues to work out. It even got a refresh in 2023 with the Steam Deck OLED and saw the creation of several competitor handheld gaming PCs. Overall, it really revitalized that market. For me, however, the Steam Deck was my first experience with PC gaming. I remember last year I was looking for a secondary console to my Switch and was torn between a PlayStation 5, Xbox Series S, and the Steam Deck. I asked the fine people of Mastodon what they thought I should choose, and the response was overwhelmingly for the Deck, at 67% of respondents. However, was I right to choose the Steam Deck over a traditional console? Is the Steam Deck a valuable addition to your gaming collection? But most importantly, is the Steam Deck worth 500 Canadian dollars? Now, before we get started on the review in full, I feel it's important to discuss how the Steam Deck and all future hardware will be evaluated. If you've watched my game reviews before, you know I use a game review rubric to evaluate games on various criteria in order to be as objective as I can, and so that you can see exactly what I'm evaluating on. In a similar vein, I've created a hardware review rubric that I'll display on your screen now. As always, while the review allows me to be as objective as possible, it's not a foolproof measure as in any review. What the reviewer thinks is important and acceptable may or may not be the same as what you think is important or acceptable. For example, I think 30 FPS is perfectly playable, but you might not. So do keep those kinds of differences in mind as we go through the review. I also may not prioritize the same things that you do, so keep that in mind as well. Anyway, let's go through the individual categories of the rubric. However, if you do just want to see the review itself, go ahead and skip to the time that's displayed on your screen now. Still here? Okay. Otherwise, let's go through the rubric. The first category I'm going to talk about is hardware. Hardware is exactly what it sounds like. It concerns the CPU, GPU, RAM, Wi-Fi, joysticks, etc. of the device being reviewed. Basically, if it's physical, it's here. In the future, I'll be able to do proper like-to-like comparisons as the hardware collection I have grows, but for now I'm limited by the wallet of my time. I'll also be looking at the device's overall longevity and usability, as well as the overall build quality. The goal here is to evaluate the quality of the hardware the device or product uses. What this section isn't going to be is synthetic benchmarks or anything similar to that. Outside of very specific situations such as like-to-like comparison tests, I personally don't find those to be helpful in the grand scheme of things. And for what we're doing with this rubric and this review, I think you'll be better off seeing how it actually plays games rather than what it scores in Geekbench. The second category is software. As important as hardware is, it's very difficult to use it to its fullest potential if the software running on it is buggy and unusable. This category assesses the overall software experience and calls out any bugs that affect the user's experience. It also talks about security and reliability. As the end user, you need to be assured that the software isn't going to crash on you regularly or otherwise get in your way. In my opinion, the best software for a product is software you forget about after a while, rather than something you have to fight with regularly. Additionally, it's important to me that the user is able to customize their experience to their liking, since not everyone wants the same cookie-cutter experience. Our third category is company reputation. When you buy a product, especially one that costs as much as the Steam Deck does, you need to know that if something goes wrong, the company will be there to support and take care of you. I was very tempted to put this at a ×2 weighting on the rubric, but I ultimately decided against it because I came up with a better idea. In the event that a product scores a 1 or a 2 on this rubric, the product automatically becomes a do not recommend regardless of its other merits. As a reviewer, I feel it's my responsibility to ensure that what I'm recommending is something I'm confident will be fixed by the company making it if something goes wrong, and that you as a consumer won't be left high and dry by a company's shady practices or a company that's actively preventing you from getting support or a warranty claim. Good customer support is key in 2024 and beyond, and I feel very strongly about that. If I ever recommend a product after giving it a 1 or a 2, please throw this clip back at me. The fourth category is repairability and upgradability. I am a big proponent of the right to repair movement and feel very strongly that a device should be easily repairable and upgradable by the end user so a device can continue to be useful for as long as possible. This means no software locks by a company of any kind to prevent upgrading or repair by the end user or a third party, or avoiding of any warranty by doing so. While I won't automatically not recommend a device if it's not easily repairable or upgradable, it will be a mark against it overall. The fifth category is library. If you're buying a device, you need to know what it can and cannot do so you can make an informed decision about your purchase. While the hardware category will play into this, the former is about the quality of what you can do and play, while this category is about the quantity of what you can do or play. We're also considering compatibility with software, which doesn't really make sense when you're talking about hardware, so that's why this category is here. And again, the final category is price. It doesn't matter how powerful a device is or what it can do, if its price is so high that it doesn't make sense. This category is here to make sure that what you're getting for your money is worth it. So a $500 device is going to have lower expectations than a $5,000 device, and higher expectations than a $300 device. It's not that any of those devices are bad necessarily, it's just one gives you better value for money, and that's what this category is there to reflect. With that in mind, let's get into the main review, talking about hardware. And the first one is fascinating because there's actually two sets of hardware. The one I'll be primarily talking about in this review, which is the LCD, and a Steam Deck OLED model that released last year with nice quality of life changes, including a 6nm APU versus a 7 on the LCD, which allows for better efficiency, faster RAM at 6400 megatransfers per second versus 5500 for the LCD, a much better battery that lasts far longer than the LCD. What all this means is in gaming, because of the faster RAM speed, the OLED is around 10% faster than the LCD in terms of frame rates. So what the frame rate shown in this review will be even better on the Steam Deck OLED. Either way, however, the CPU is based on a Zen 2 architecture, and the GPU is based on RDNA 2 from AMD, with a 15-watt TDP that you can adjust down to 4 watts depending on what you're playing or how far from a socket you are. I usually leave the TDP alone though, unless I'm going to be far away from a power outlet, since turning down the TDP is very helpful for battery life. However, it's not something that you have to tinker with, but it's there if you want to squeeze as much as possible out of your battery. Now, technically speaking, you can turn it down to 3 watts. I'm going to recommend against it though, outside of very specific circumstances, because in my experience, 3 watts isn't quite enough for the APU to do its thing. I would usually call it at 4. It also comes with 16 gigabytes of LPDDR5 RAM that's shared between the CPU and GPU, which in my experience is enough to run modern titles on. I've never felt that I needed more memory than what the deck has while I'm playing games on it, at least not for the CPU. By default, the Steam Deck sets aside 1GB of that 16GB of RAM as VRAM for the GPU, but you can go into the BIOS and set it to 4GB, which is what I've done. This usually improves performance on Steam Deck, but there are some games that do get worse performance, most notably Red Dead Redemption 2. You'll always want to look up the deck's performance on any game or piece of software you want to use before buying it or playing it, but that's something I'll talk more about in the library section. What I do want to talk about here is the deck itself. It's quite a bit heavier and bulkier than my Switch, but it doesn't feel so heavy to me that I can't keep using it for extended periods of time. In fact, I find that my hands fit the Steam Deck a lot more comfortably than they do the Switch. And when you've got carpal tunnel from years of competitive Smash, that's a huge deal. And the overall build quality feels solid to me as well. I've never once thought it felt cheap or poorly put together in the year I've had it, and I've actually been pleasantly surprised at how well it's held up despite the number of times that I've dropped it. Even the buttons themselves feel pretty good. Personally, I wish the deck had very slightly larger buttons, since I do sometimes miss input, and the ABXY layout is based on Xbox and not what the Switch has. But that comes down to personal preference. And besides, you can change it to the Nintendo layout in settings, so that's pretty good. And it's not an issue with the device itself. In terms of expandability, you've got a micro SD slot just like what you've got on Switch, which is good for easy storage expansion. I wouldn't recommend putting any games that require an SSD on it, but it's a great place to put your ROMs and games that can run off a hard drive. I have a 512GB microSD I use for ROM storage, and it's perfect for that. Internally, you've got a Gen 3x4 M.2 2230 SSD that's either 256GB, 512GB, or 1TB depending. You can still get a 64GB eMMC model if you want to, but if you can, I'd get the ones with an SSD unless you're planning to upgrade, which I'll talk about later. You've also got a 10GB per second USB-C port on top of the Steam Deck that supports data transfer, charging, and output to displays. There's nothing special about it, and it's just a regular USB-C port, which is really good to see. Valve even sells an official dock for the Steam Deck if you want to buy it. However, I'm going to recommend just finding a dock on Amazon or something similar and calling it done. The Steam Deck's dock, to my understanding, isn't anything special, and while it does come with an extra power supply, any power supply greater than 45 watts is going to be fine too. I'm also going to note that the Steam Deck doesn't support fast charging, so charging it from zero will take a while no matter what wattage you plug into it, but personally, I don't mind that. What I do mind is the power supply itself. The problem to me is that the cable's only 1.5 meters and is permanently attached, so you can't switch out the cables in the event it gets damaged. However, this problem can be solved by either leaving your Steam Deck power supply at home and taking a different one with you when you travel, which is what I do, or just using and replacing it as needed. However, I would have preferred it if the cable could be detached, since it would help reduce e-waste in the long term. It's not going to affect the score today, but I do think it's worth mentioning just in case. And if you're worried, I'd recommend getting something that can detach from either end. My MacBook charger does that, and it's really good. I use it for the Steam Deck when I'm going out and about. It's really nice. As part of your purchase as well, your Steam Deck comes with a carrying case, which is really nice. I always put my deck in its case when I'm traveling and taking it with me somewhere. The case itself is pretty bulky, but I also think it's pretty protective of the deck when it's inside, so again, I don't mind. And this device as a travel companion is just on another level of awesomeness. Over the past year, I've taken it on car trips, on flights, and it's just been a champ. I remember last September, I took the Steam Deck on a flight between Calgary and Winnipeg, which if you're not Canadian, you don't live in Western Canada, is around a 90-minute flight. And I played Starfield on it the whole time, and the battery went from 100% to around 30%. I had fully expected to have to put it away, but the fact that I didn't have to was and is very impressive. And then this May, I went to the UK and took the deck on a flight from Calgary to Heathrow, and forgot to charge the deck the night before. So it was around 80% when the flight started. I just set the TDP to 4 watts, booted up Dolphin, played Ocarina of Time Master Quest the entire 8-hour flight with headphones on, and the Steam Deck dropped to around 20% out of that. Now, I actually couldn't believe it made it the whole way, and not even on full power. And it's important to mention, all of this is with the LCD model, not the OLED with even better battery life. However, it's not all good news on the hardware front. Sadly, there is one area of the deck I'm not happy with, which is the Bluetooth. See, coming from a Nintendo Switch, I wanted to use my Pro controllers with the Steam Deck when I've got it docked. But the deck simply cannot maintain a consistent Bluetooth connection. My other devices all can, but the deck simply can't. However, everything else I tested and used with it over the past year has worked fine, so it could just be down to a Pro controller issue. But either way, I did want to mention it because I suspect a fair number of Switch owners will be interested in the Steam Deck, and this is something they should know before buying it. All of that said, if this was the largest issue I encountered hardware-wise, I don't think it's so bad. As for overall performance, for what the Steam Deck is, it's very solid. As a handheld, the screen is 800p at 60Hz for the LCD and 800p at 90Hz for the OLED. You're going to be able to get good performance out of the Steam Deck at 800p most of the time, but it's going to be on low to medium settings in modern titles. However, with that said, you will be able to get 60 FPS, and if you turn things up, you can lock to 40 FPS, which is a good sweet spot for the Steam Deck in my opinion. but again, this will depend on your tastes and the games that you're playing. As a general rule though, in my experience, you can lock games to 60 FPS if they came out on the Xbox 360 or PS3 or earlier, 30 to 40 FPS if the game came out on PS4 and Xbox One, and 30 if the game came out on the Xbox Series S or X or PS5. However, do be aware that current gen titles such as Starfield will require compromises to get there. So make sure you're looking up gameplay before you buy if you intend to solely play on the Steam Deck. One exception to this rule is Dragon's Dogma 2, which isn't playable. But that's mostly down to that game's particular optimization issues, not the Steam Deck itself. As for docked, the USB-C port can support 4K output, but outside of indie games and 20-year-old AAA games, you're not going to get the Steam Deck to run at a reasonable frame rate at 4K, or even 1440p. Remember, this is a handheld working with 15 watts, so please temper your expectations accordingly. What it can do well in my experience, however, is 1080p gaming. Mostly. You will be at 30 FPS here most of the time, but sometimes you can get 40 if you adjust settings and use upscalers like FSR or XeSS. Horizon Zero Dawn, for example, I can get to run at 1080p 40 FPS using FSR on quality and original settings, and it looks fine to me. But your mileage and taste may vary. However, if you can't get 1080p to work, the other sweet spot I found is 900p. In my experience, and in my opinion, it looks just about as good as 1080p and isn't as stressful as on the GPU. It's also a 16:9 aspect ratio, so your TV and monitor should be able to handle it alright. Is it as visually impressive as an Xbox Series S? No. But it gets the job done and you can take the deck wherever you want, which you can't say about an Xbox Series S. Overall, the Steam Deck should be able to handle AAA gaming for a long time to come, albeit with some graphical compromises. You might be stuck at 720p docked to a TV as the deck gets older, but if you can live with that, which I can, you'll be fine. Besides, I bet on Steam Deck 2 coming out before that happens too often. After all that, I'm now ready to give a score on the hardware. Overall, the Steam Deck's hardware is top-notch and good quality. While the screen on the LCD isn't as good as the one on the OLED, it's still solid and gets the job done. Current gen titles are very playable right now, albeit with some compromises, although I suspect that as the 8th generation of consoles is phased out over the next year or two, that will change. However, this review deals with what is. So as such, I'm awarding it a score of 4 out of 4, with the understanding that as the current gen consoles continue, this score will drop. And if you want more performance out of a handheld gaming PC, there are options on the Windows-based handhelds such as the Lenovo Legion Go, which again is not the subject of this review. With all that done, let's move on to software. In software, we're greeted with even more good news. If you're like me and are an anything but Windows user, the Steam Deck runs on SteamOS, which is based on Arch Linux. This means the operating system is light, nimble, and more resources can be devoted to gaming. It also means a more secure operating system, since of course you're running Linux, and a lower likelihood of running into bugs. More on that later. You're also not forced to update whenever an update comes out, which is a huge win. You can switch between various release stages, so stable, which is what it sounds like, beta, which is less stable but still alright, and preview, which has a few more bugs, but you get the newest features. But I would recommend staying on stable unless you're okay with extra bugs and kinks that haven't quite been worked out by Valve. There are two distinct modes in SteamOS, game mode and desktop mode. Game mode provides a very console-like experience. Realistically, you could probably use the deck its entire life and never leave game mode except to buy games. It's got a solid UI and I've got nothing to complain about with it. However, for me, the real fun lies in desktop mode. Now, desktop mode is exactly what it sounds like. It spits you out onto a Linux desktop environment and kind of lets you do your thing. You can game just like you're on a regular PC through Steam, or open a terminal window, or basically whatever you want. After all, SteamOS is a fully fledged desktop operating system. That means you can do all the things a regular PC can do. If you really wanted to, you could use it to take notes in classes, or do software development, or whatever you use your regular computer for. You probably shouldn't do these things since I don't think it would be the best experience, but the fact that you can at all is truly incredible. And if you hooked it up to a mouse, keyboard, and monitor, it would probably do pretty well at it. Do note though that you'll need to enable developer mode to get any packages from the command line. But again, for 99% of users, you won't need to worry about that at all and are going to be perfectly fine in game mode. However, if you want to, there are plenty of things to get in desktop mode. Personally, I use Decky and a lot of its plugins to customize how my deck sounds and all that, and I use Cryo utilities to improve performance via an increased swap file, among other changes. You can also download EmuDeck to put various emulators on your system, which I've also done. More on that later. The other thing about it being a fully fledged operating system and therefore a PC is you get easy access to the BIOS, which means you can undervolt and overclock. Personally, I've got a 30 millivolt undervolt on the CPU, SoC, and GPU on my Steam Deck, and while in the past I've had a solid overclock on both the CPU and GPU, I don't right now because SteamOS hasn't allowed overclocking on the LCD at the time of recording without workarounds, and I don't want to do the workarounds again. However, not every Steam Deck can be undervolted or overclocked, and some can be more undervolted and overclocked than others. Therefore, for a casual user, I do not recommend doing this, as you could easily brick your deck if you're not careful. If you're going to, however, make sure you follow a tutorial on how to do it. And let me be clear, I am not responsible if you brick your deck. Undervolt and overclock at your own risk. The only issue I've got with SteamOS is Steam Remote Play just gets broken every couple of updates and then fixed a couple of updates later. If you don't use Steam Remote Play, you're fine, but if you do and you're trying to play with a friend or something, it can be very annoying and has led to a lot of frustration for me. Well, that and the operating system being immutable unless you tell it not to be, but that's more of a I love tinkering problem and less an actual problem with SteamOS. With all that in mind, I'm now ready to give a score on the software. Overall, SteamOS is a very secure, stable, and excellent experience. While the remote play bug is annoying, it's not something I use often enough to affect the score, and it does get fixed, so as long as you stay on a fixed version of SteamOS, you're going to be fine. I also really enjoy the customization options SteamOS provides me, and don't know what I'd tinker with without them. With all that in mind, I rate software at a 4 out of 4. With software done, let's move on to company reputation. Yeah, I'm just going to be blunt here. It's a 4 out of 4. Steam support is incredible and is just on another level. Every experience I've had with them has been great, and they've gone out of their way repeatedly to help myself and others with problems. Heck, I know they've even taken Steam Deck repairs under warranty when said decks were a couple of days out of warranty, which they didn't have to do. And if every company had support as good as Steam support, nobody would have support complaints ever again. Keep crushing it, Steam support. You're the real MVPs. Anyway, now that that's out of the way, let's talk about repairability and upgradability. This is another area the deck excels in. Valve has made replacement parts available via iFixit, so you can repair the deck yourself if you need to, which is good to see. There are some exceptions regarding the battery and the charge port, according to them, but it scores a 7 out of 10 on repairability, so there are worse fates. Personally, I've never needed to repair the Steam Deck, but it's good to know I can for the most part if I need to. As for upgradability, the deck is quite solid. The internal storage isn't soldered and is just a generic M.2 2230, so you can upgrade it to 2 terabytes of internal storage. And as someone who's done exactly that, it's a huge quality of life improvement. You will need the SteamOS recovery image to get SteamOS back onto that new SSD, but that's going to be true for any storage upgrade that you do, so I don't think it's as big a deal. Please also note that yes, the 2230 drives are the most expensive compared to the 2280, but I'm guessing for Steam Deck 2, it's going to be a 2280 drive, so I'm not worried about that aspect of it. You can even switch out the deck plates for custom ones if you want to. Again, I haven't because I like the way the Steam Deck looks, but you can. And if that's not enough, the joysticks and buttons can be upgraded as well. Again, I haven't bothered with either of these, but you can if you want to. In theory, you can also upgrade the RAM, but that requires soldering and a whole lot of extra steps, so I'd recommend against doing it unless you really, really know what you're doing or know someone who does. You should probably file the RAM upgrade under the heading of, can you? Yes. Should you? Probably not. With all this in mind, I'm ready to give a score for repairability and upgradability. Overall, the deck is quite repairable and quite upgradable. While there are definitely things I wouldn't recommend upgrading, the fact that you can, at all, It's very impressive. I therefore award a score of 4 out of 4 for repairability and upgradability. Now, let's move on to the library. Throughout this review, you may be wondering how the deck has been playing the games it's been playing. After all, it's not like these games are native to Linux, so what gives? See, Valve has a trick up its sleeves called Proton. Proton is a compatibility layer that allows Windows games to run on Linux. And as time has gone on, it's gotten to a point where Linux gaming is viable for a majority of users. Because of Proton, the Steam Deck can play an overwhelming majority of what's on Steam. In fact, Valve has helpfully provided a system so Steam Deck users know what's good and what's not. Games that are verified on deck work out of the box like a console experience. Playable means it's fine but needs some tinkering. Unsupported means as of testing it doesn't work. And a question mark means there's not enough information to make a call. This system should be great, but too often I found that it doesn't actually mean anything. Take for example Witcher 2. According to Valve, it's unsupported on deck, but it looks like it's working perfectly fine to me. What I'd recommend looking at instead is ProtonDB to see how it rates games, since it'll be more up to date and accurate. I actually have the Decky plugin that lets me see the ProtonDB ratings directly on screen, so I know exactly what I'm getting myself into when I prepare to play a game. And I trust it over Valve's verification system at this time. And because of Proton and how many games work on both on Linux and Steam Deck, owners can take advantage of sales that are usually much better than what's on consoles without worrying about native Linux compatibility. And that's before we get to the Steam Deck's real party piece: emulation. See, as I've talked about earlier, you can download an application called EmuDeck, which will install various emulators to the Steam Deck. Obviously, you'll need to supply your own ROMs, but that's totally fine by me and is, I think, completely reasonable. And emulation on Steam Deck is just so natural that you forget it's even there. Every Wii and Wii U game you see on this channel is emulated on Dolphin or CMU via the Steam Deck. It's good to emulate pretty much any Nintendo console. Even the Switch, although the Switch is a bit harder to at the moment. You can emulate the original Xbox, the Xbox 360, the PS1, the PS2, and even the PS3. It's a very solid emulation station, one I'll be using long after I've upgraded from the Steam Deck. Now, you can play esports titles as well, but there is a catch. Because of the way that some of these games do anti-cheat, the Steam Deck won't be able to play natively. However, you can use something like GeForce Now or Game Pass Cloud to play them just fine. That said, some games are fine to run on the deck itself, but you do need to check on a case-by-case basis. With all that in mind, I'm ready to give a score on library. The deck's collection of games is massive and can play just about anything on the Steam store, just about anything you can emulate, and even esports titles through the cloud. I debated about the score to give it here, and I find it landing just between 3.5 and a 4, losing the 0.5 to esports titles that need to run on the cloud. However, because in my opinion, a person playing an esports title will probably want more frames than the deck can push anyway, outside of the super casual use case covered by the cloud, I'm going to call it for 4 out of 4. But with the caveat that in the event the cloud is no longer viable for the Steam Deck for whatever reason, it becomes a 3.5 out of 4. Finally, let's talk about price. And it's a weird one because there are actually a couple of options. $500 Canadian gets you a 256GB Steam Deck LCD, but for $439 Canadian you can get a 64GB eMMC Steam Deck LCD. And finally, for $559 you can have a 512GB SSD LCD model. If you can get one, of course, because certain Valve refurbished models would likely be cheaper than that, but at the time of writing they had none in stock, so I can't give an exact price. However, if you're willing to spend a bit more, you can get a 512GB OLED and a 1TB OLED for $689 Canadian and $819 Canadian respectively. All of these are perfectly good for what you're getting. However, I'd recommend getting either the 64GB LCD and then upgrading the internal drive to 1 or 2 terabytes if you're comfortable with that, or know someone who is, or getting the 512GB OLED and doing the same if that OLED display sounds better to you. However, if you're not comfortable with upgrading the SSD, or you don't know someone who is, I'd recommend getting as much storage as you can since it fills up fast. The only model I will recommend against at this time is the 512GB LCD, since at that point I'd say to either get the 256GB LCD and upgrade the SSD, or get the 512 OLED and spend a little bit more. Other than that though, you can't really go wrong here. Just make the choice that fits your budget and your technical know-how the best. So with that in mind, I'm ready to give it a score. Overall, for what you get, the Steam Deck is incredible value. It's not the most powerful handheld out there, but it's pretty solid, and the price reflects that. I therefore award it a score of 4 out of 4 on price. For everything the deck can do, it's an incredibly fair price, and Valve could realistically charge more, and I think it would still be worth it. So to answer our initial question, yes, the Steam Deck is worth $500 Canadian. It got perfect scores across the board, albeit with some caveats, but is overall one of the best console handheld hybrids you can buy today. However, that said, you should consider the Steam Deck if you value portability and are willing to compromise on power. You're okay with 1080p on the high end, you're okay with Linux rather than Windows, you primarily play single-player titles, you're looking to get into PC gaming, but you don't want to make a huge investment, or you are a PC gamer but want a handheld to play on while you're out and about or sitting on the couch. That being said, you should consider a Windows-based handheld, such as the Lenovo Legion Go, if you meet all of the above but want Windows over Linux. You probably shouldn't consider a Steam Deck if you're looking for a more traditional console experience or something that's higher performance. At that point, I'd probably recommend going with either an Xbox Series S, or a Switch, or a PlayStation 5. And anyway, thank you guys so much for watching. If you did enjoy, please make sure to like and subscribe. That's how I know this kind of thing is something you want to see more of. I also know that I can't cover everything in these reviews. So if I missed something important, or you think I've made a mistake, or you thought I crushed it, leave a comment letting me know. It helps me and the channel out a lot. Other than that, thanks once again for watching, and I'll see you on the next one. Goodbye.